Greetings, gardeners. Tomorrow is Halloween. And since I'd been telling ghost stories and weird UFO stories and whatever right along here this month, I'd like to wrap everything up the day before Halloween with one final creepy tale. This is not a ghost story, but it is supernatural. So, I call this story Living on Native American Time. I had been helping my good friends Val and Alex move materials from Chicago up to northern Wisconsin because I had the truck. They were building a cabin up there on an 80-acre piece on the lake. It was really a nice piece of land. And this traveling with them, I'd grown an attachment for the state. I had some family history there. My stepfather's family owned a rundown farm in the bottom of what used to be old Glacier Lake, Wisconsin. It was a sand farm, lake bottom. I spent many happy hours there as a boy, hiking in the woods with my dog and plinking at cans with a .22 rifle. By this point in my life, though, I had become married, and I was getting pretty tired of life in Illinois near Chicago and decided that Wisconsin was my future. And so we bought some property in northern Wisconsin next to the Flathead River State Forest. We were part of the Back to the Land movement that was taking hold in the country at the time. I had little experience in country living, but I was no stranger to it either. Things went quite well for a while, but it really doesn't matter where you go. The destructive industrial practices of our society will catch up with you sooner or later. There is no escape. Well, we lived at a place where animals like bear, timber wolf, and deer were common. Fishing was amazing. People would drive hundreds of miles to enjoy what we had right outside our front door. It was a good life. But one day we got the news that the world's largest mining conglomerate, Rio Tinto Zinc, was planning to start a copper mine on the river we lived on. This hurt us very deeply. In my travels as a musician and otherwise, I had seen many areas of this country that were completely destroyed by the work of miners. Places were economically depressed once the mining companies pull out. The water is polluted, the land is forsaken and destroyed. Oh, Daddy, won't you take me back to Muhlenberg County, down by the Green River where paradise lay. Well, I'm sorry, my son, but you're too late in asking. Mr. Peabody's coal train has hauled it away. Yeah. Like John Prine says, it's rough stuff, mining. And that night, I fell into a dream. In this dream, I saw every place that I'd ever been damaged by mining extraction. I saw the dead streams that ran in sick colors because of the toxic waste of the mines. I saw the landscapes that were denuded and barren from the digging. Worst of all were the hopeless people, the families that had tried to hang on after the mining companies had pulled up stakes. I saw towns and economies that were destroyed. They were all forsaken by men. I realized in the dream that I would not be able to live with myself if I did not act. I woke that night in a cold sweat, swearing that I could not let it happen here. The next day I spoke with a friend who was into the environmental issues of the area. He encouraged me to show up at an anti-mining rally put on by Roscoe and Evelyn Churchill. It was at Roscoe's farm where I first met an Ojibwe shaman. The tribes had an interest in the mine because the water pollution in the river would violate their ceded rights to the fish. People had broken into various circles, and depending on interests and connection to the issue, I had decided to join a circle conducted by the shaman, which was mostly a blessing to give strength to the people opposing the mine. The shaman stood in the center and held tobacco to the 4 points of the world, asking for a blessing. I took a spot in the circle at about 3 o'clock with my son Steve by my side. As the shaman held the tobacco up to the sky, I suddenly heard a voice in my head that seemed to come from above me. It said, "Your son will bear the tobacco." That was the end of the message. Not very exciting, I suppose, but a moment later, the shaman selected Steve to carry tobacco around the circle and distribute a bit to each person at the event. It was the beginning of an event chain that took me deeper and deeper into the world of Native American shamanic magic. Eventually, I found myself walking in a twilight zone filled with eagle feathers and sage smoke. Opposition to the mine began to build. It made strange bedfellows, like the Sierra Club, found themselves on the same side of the table with the Ojibwe and with sport fishermen. I became an outspoken figure representing a local citizens group. My face started showing up on the nightly news and in the newspapers from Minneapolis to Chicago. My mother would call me from Chicago and let me know I was in the Tribune again. The tribe had a 100,000 watt FM transmitter on the reservation, and they were glad to help us get the word out over the airwaves. I became a regular voice on their shows using a link by phone. Eventually, it all came down to the hearing over the environmental impact statement. I was chosen to represent the citizens group at the hearings. The meetings were stacked with lawyers and experts. I was just this farmer guy with no expertise other than a good speaking presence. This is where synchronicities began to show up. I was given 100 pounds of documents on the mining project and told to study them for the hearings. This is what we refer to as an environmental impact statement, and it was a huge carton, as I say, weighing nearly 100 pounds. I realized that I had two fishing buddies who might be able to help me. One was a lake and groundwater scientist with the EPA, and the other was a geologist who worked for the Soil Conservation Department of the U.S. government. I had known these guys since before they had such important job titles. It was a small miracle that they were still around to help me with the documents. So, Wally and Ulf decided to help me if I bought the beer. The process went like this. We would open beers all around and then reach into the boxes and pull out a sheet of paper, passing one to Wally, one to Ulf, and one to myself. We would read the page, searching for anything that looked like a problem. It appears that I had the magic fingers because over half the sheets I pulled seemed to have some sort of a problematic issue on them. I suppose the mining company didn't actually think anybody would read this stuff. The best one was the disclosure that the deposit contained a number of rare earth minerals that were highly reactive in the environment. They were to be discharged into the river after entering through some settling ponds. They were also planning to use salt as a de-icer on the mine roads in the wintertime. This salt would also go into the settling ponds. Sodium chloride, otherwise known as salt, and rare earth minerals can begin to create all sorts of strange synergistic reactions when they are put into water solution. I carried this with me as ammo into the first hearing. Now, synergism is basically the chemical reaction of 2 + 2 = 6. Okay, you end up putting two things together in such a way that you never would have anticipated what the byproduct might be from that. And when you're dealing with any molecule that contains a chloride, the reaction is unpredictable because chlorine is missing an electron in the outer shell, and so it begins to bind with anything it can find to fill that void. The tribes had decided to broadcast the entire hearing process live over their 100,000-watt radio transmitter. This signal covered all of northern Wisconsin and even touched parts of upper Minnesota and upper Michigan. When the hearings got to the part about de-icing the mine roads, I cross-examined the technical expert on the subject. I slowly walked him towards a pit in his logic, and in the end I pushed him into a hole he had dug for himself. He wasn't ready for this farmer guy to kick his ass into a hole made out of his own science and then toss the shovel made out of salt and rare earth in to bury himself with. You could hear a pin drop in the hall. When the silence broke, the entire room was asking what page of the documents was I referring to. Realizing that it was perfectly legal to be slow and stupid, and that bogging down these hearings to a crawl was my best defense. Remember, I was up against highly paid lawyers, experts, scientists, government officials, and so on. I thumbed through my papers and then gave them all the wrong page number. Papers rustled, faces turned red and sweaty as lawyers and experts dug through their stack but came up with nothing. Eventually, the Department of Natural Resources scientist turned to me and exclaims, "There is nothing about de-icing on page 96. I replied, "Did I say page 96? Oh, I'm sorry, I meant 205, line 96. They knew I was screwing with them, but there was nothing they could do. A mistake is a mistake. The reaction to my discovery was that they would find an alternative means of de-icing the road. It was small, but it was a victory for the little guy. The unseen reaction came from people all over the state who heard it on the radio. I remember talking to a farmer who had been out plowing his field with the radio on. When he heard this regular farmer guy shoot the experts full of holes, he decided the project must be as crappy as we claimed. He wasn't the only one that sent us money to help support the struggle. I began to achieve a special status with the tribes. Everywhere I went, they had their shamans there. I would be smudged with sage smoke and fanned with cedar boughs. I became a focal point of their power. Some strange things happened that convinced me that the shaman's magic was real. One of the oddest happenings occurred during the latter part of the hearings at the state capitol. Before entering the hearings that morning, I was confronted by a shaman who told me not to worry, that they would be outside praying for me. I remember seeing them do a dance in the parking lot during one of the breaks. The hearings were in process, and I was pushing my pain-in-the-ass technique to the edge. The hearing examiner had warned me twice that if I did not watch it, he would eject me from the room. Because of my efforts, these had already become the longest sets of hearings and appeals ever on the record on the state of Wisconsin. The hearing examiner was sure to let me know that. Knowing this, I relaxed some. Most of the voices in the room drifted off to a rumble of blah, 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 blah. As I drifted off in my thoughts, I began to hear drums. I looked around and realized the drum sound was in my mind. It grew louder, and soon I began to see sage smoke in my mind's eye, drifting across in big clouds. The vision became intense, pounding Indian drums, and the smoke grew thicker by the second. I became aware that the shaman outside the building was casting a spell, and that he was using me as a lightning rod inside the room. As the smoke grew thicker in my mind, the hearing examiner and the mining company lawyer began to cough and choke. They both tried to get to a glass of water. For the examiner, the water seemed to work, but for the lawyer, it was useless. He could not stop coughing long enough to take a drink. and had to be helped from the room to get air outside. The examiner called a recess. When we returned, the mining company lawyer had stopped choking, but we had to leave because his daughter had collapsed at home and had to be taken to the hospital. I see it as no coincidence that she had to be put on oxygen because she couldn't breathe properly. In the process of battling with Rio Tinto Zinc, I had made a name for myself as an environmental activist. I was invited to take part in the President's Commission on Mining in Denver. That was Ronald Reagan's straw man process on mining. Later, I was asked to speak at an environmental organization up in Duluth. They were having problems with a chemical company polluting the surface water in the area, but they couldn't make any headway with fighting them. They wanted to hear from me about the success we were having against the miners in Wisconsin. The meeting was in a ski chalet at the top of Spirit Mountain overlooking Lake Superior. The building had picture windows all around, and the view would have been spectacular if we hadn't been completely shrouded in by dense fog that morning. I could hardly see 6 feet in front of my face. There were people all around the table who had things to say, and there was also a shaman. Before we started, the shaman gave a blessing and then handed an eagle feather to the first speaker. Each person in turn would hold the feather as they spoke and then pass it to the next one who had something to say. As the feather came around to me, I spoke of how you have to step outside of your fear, because doing battle against large corporations is a very frightening thing. I spoke about remaining open and seeking the proper opportunity. I told them how you can move the world with a small gesture if the time is right, but how it seems impossible when it isn't. Finally, I assured them that what they needed to do would soon become clear, and then compared the situation to the fog outside the building. I told them that right now they were surrounded by a fog of confusion, but eventually it would break and expose the solution. When it happens, it will be just like the fog breaking around this building today and allowing us to see all the way up the Lake Superior shoreline to Canada. As I spoke these words, the fog did lift and exposed all the blue lake and sky stretching all the way up the shore of northern Minnesota. Many people in the room seemed moved, but not a word was spoken. The shaman just stared at me with a look that I had seen before. After the meeting, he came to me outside and shook my hand. We stood and looked at each other, but said nothing. Without words, he had let me know that nothing need be said as we walked away from the encounter. Later that evening, I got a call from one of the guys in Duluth. He was excited and wanted to let me know that on the way home they found a leaking pipe at the chemical plant that was flooding the road. Now they finally had the company dead to rights. It was just as I had said. Eventually, the solution would become clear. These were strange times for me. The magic that was put on me didn't go away easily. It followed me around and affected my life. I really couldn't tell anybody about it. I tried to tell my wife, but she assumed I was cracking up, and eventually she divorced me. In the long run, it turned out that there was nothing wrong with me. The problem with magic is it doesn't just affect what it is set out to achieve. It tore my entire life to shreds and almost destroyed me. I really don't expect you to believe this. Nobody ever does. Well, there you have it, folks. Yes, there was a time when I was an environmental activist and worked even with the United States government, helping to shape mining laws, did battle against the government of the state of Wisconsin and so forth, and was on the nightly news and the newspapers and so on, and blah, blah, and so forth. Most of us born in the United States are aware that the tribes do have spiritual leaders that we call shamans, but I really don't know how many of us ever actually had the experience of walking with these men and women, because the world that they live in is a twilight zone. And what we consider to be real and solid and concrete in their world is flexible, movable. Reality can be changed. I do not understand how they do it, but the fact that it truly does exist and it's real, I am a believer. I would not cross any native traditions in this country if I were you. Don't do that. That includes making fun of Pele and Hawaiian spiritualism here too. Not a smart thing to do. Happy Halloween. Be careful what you believe in, but make sure to believe. Wow.